Good afternoon, Antra.
Good afternoon.
How are you today?
Fine, thank you.
Well, our audience is eager to hear your insights on the new vision and of new competencies, so I give the floor to you.
And hello from Denmark. I'm really happy to be able to share the Nordic insights, but also to listen in to colleagues from the Baltic and the Nordic countries discuss these very important issues of yesterday and today in this conference. As you can see from my presentation, the title is about everyone's competencies should count, because the change calls for that. I don't think anyone would disagree with that, both in our Nordic region and the Baltic countries. But it is easy to be said, maybe not so easy to be done. So there's a lot to be done still in the Nordic region. So I will talk about how we are trying to cope and promote change, and what are the mechanisms and tools the Nordic countries together are working on. Like you said in the introduction, I represent the Nordic Network for Adult Learning, and the network unites all the Nordic countries. That means the 5 Nordic countries and the 3 autonomous areas. And there are national coordinators in each of the network country, and they represent all sectors of adult learning: formal learning, non-formal learning, university, workplace-based learning. And we try to collect the main stakeholders, the main experts from all the Nordic countries in the networks, working on the themes and priorities of the Nordic countries, as you said. The Nordic governments have decided to put together resources, human resources, money, also a lot of time to this cooperation, because the idea is that something that is put together, we pool the resources, and then we create something that is beneficial and useful for all the countries, that can be then taken home to the national context, policy and practice, and be used. So this added value of Nordic cooperation, that's a long-lasting tradition, and we work through comparing different countries, gathering evidence, producing reports, analysis, and then organizing meeting places for discussing this. In my presentation, I will touch upon a few facts, few things about why Nordic cooperation has been important and still is important. Then to present some examples, national and Nordic, about the country strategies and policies, how they are working at the moment in order to promote lifelong learning, and then end up with a few concrete examples within the fields that were introduced concerning the basic skills development, how to get everyone on board, how we are working on the validation of prior learning, recognition of competencies, and also learning at work. Before I further go on into my presentation, just some facts concerning the Nordic cooperation that are really at the basis of this cooperation and important to know in order to understand it better. The 3 first points, they are historically being developed, and it's a long-lasting tradition. One is that the Nordic countries have decided actively and created this cooperation in order to be able to share experiences, share good practices, share not so good practices. And what is important, that is being done regularly and systematically. And this is what the Nordic governments put the resources into through different programs and institutions, organizations like mine, that support this continuous exchange and learning. And the other part, which is important for lifelong learning thinking, is the public sector, the strong public sector that has a tradition to invest in learning, invest in education, and certainly support specific groups in the society that at different times need more support for learning, and of course trying to get people with low education levels into learning. And this is the process that doesn't end, because we get new cohorts of people coming into a working life that needs support for basic skills development. And also the tradition of social partners. The employers' organizations and trade unions have been and are active in competence policy development, And when it comes to long-term strategic development investments, there is this tripartite agreement in the Nordic countries that is really at the basis of the development trends. And finally, the fourth point is that is relevant, of course, in many countries, also in the Nordic and Baltic region. The last year, 2020, and the pandemic has put very strong focus on digital skills and basic digital skills, but also on the recognition of competencies and really making all competencies count due to these rapid changes that we have experienced in the labor market due to the pandemic. So this is the background for the Nordic cooperation historically and also at the time being. And then if we go on to a few slides with some facts about how does it look, are people willing to learn, what is the motivation factor? And we know the results from PIAC showed that the higher the education level, the more interest for learning throughout life. And here you can see that the Nordic average, the higher the education level, the column to the right is almost as double as high as the one to the left with low level of education. And this continues through working life and is valid also through professional life and participating in lifelong learning when people get to work. The Norwegian professor has studied further the PIAC data and looked at working force, at elderly working force 45, 65, and the level of education still plays a role at that age, even if there is a long-lasting working life behind you. Those who have a higher education have a higher motivation learning throughout life and participating in lifelong learning also at workplaces. So this is about interest in learning and also looking at work. How do people look at the joy of work or willingness to work, going to work? And then if you see the different age groups, the top curve here is a thicker, greener curve. These are workers 60 plus, and they are happy to go to work. They got a question, do you like your work? Do you enjoy being at your workplace? And the elderly workers all confirm that they are happy to be part of working life. Having said these good things about motivation of learning, about joy of working, we still know that there are skills gaps in Europe that were also mentioned as introduction to this part about lifelong learning. Putting this in the European perspective very shortly, we know that the low qualified jobs are diminishing in Europe. This is a survey from 2019, just before pandemic, and that the goal in many countries, and the countries are striving for, is to diminish this part, the low qualified, low level education adults who are part of the labor market, which leaves us that the workplace is still a very important arena and learning takes place throughout life. It doesn't only happen in the education system, but it happens also in working life. So summing up this why cooperation, and I mentioned the challenges that PIAC showed us, they are not new, but they are still there. And also the potential of using the workforce, working life as a learning arena is a common challenge for the Nordic countries. So these are some of the challenges that go across the countries, and the Nordic cooperation has decided to put certain priorities in order to cope with these challenges in a collaborative way. And also that there are still people, even if they have lower education levels, but there is a motivation to learn, so there is a good potential for upskilling and reskilling. And here's the exchange of information and experience between the Nordic countries is essential to find really those good solutions, how to reach the target groups that are potentially really open for learning, but are not there as yet. So from here, I will then move to the second part, a few examples from the Nordic countries, recent initiatives, policies, what is being done in the countries, how to make the best out of this situation of pandemic when people have been sent home, some have been sent away from their workplaces, how to use this time for learning, for competence development. So I will start with a few national initiatives. We will also hear more about this during the presentations later today from Norway and Sweden, and then I will move on to the common Nordic policy. Norway has worked really a lot concerning competence mapping and competence forecasting, and the reform from 2020 came really at the time it was needed. And that means that the aim of this reform, learning throughout life, was to ensure that no adult should leave the working life because the competences are redundant, that they are too old. And at the same time, the reform aims to provide the labor market with the skills that are in demand, that are needed, and to see that those skills and competencies that the employees have match these demands, so that they should not get outdated and there is a continuous competence development. Finland, during the last several years, from 19 to 21, have been looking at their lifelong learning system. There's been a broad consultation process with a wide range of stakeholders about discussing where do we want to go in our country, do we want to organize lifelong learning, and the strategy has been created through this dialogue process. Finland also looked at all the Nordic countries and made a comparative analysis about how the governance of lifelong learning looks in Norway, in Sweden, and in Iceland. And based on this work, now there is a strategy for lifelong learning, of continuous learning. And the aim is that there should be more coordinated efforts and there should be many sectors supporting lifelong learning, that it is not only an issue of education sector, but it's also social, it's also labor market should contribute to this. And a very recent example from Sweden from this year, there is a suggestion about the legislation change that should support the development of the labor force, both flexibility, adaptability to new jobs, and also security. Again, that people do not get redundant, their skills do not get obsolete, and they can stay in the labor market and be secure. And the proposed suggestion is to keep about 80% of the salary and acquire either totally new education or continue with the education related to the work you are doing. So, and this should apply to all different sectors of education where this competence development can take place. So as you can see here, the countries are really looking at different measures and introducing different measures in order to keep up to date and help adults develop throughout their whole life. And if we look at the Nordic cooperation, the Nordic governments together adopted Vision 2030. This vision was adopted in 2019 during the Icelandic presidency, and it consists of 3 parts. We are striving towards green Nordic region, towards competitive Nordic region, and towards socially sustainable Nordic region. All these 3 parts should be developed they should be interlinked in order to achieve this goal of sustainable and integrated Nordic region. And as you can recognize, this vision is closely linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, but the Nordic governments decided that they want together the whole region to move faster. This is why this vision was adopted. And in order to closely follow, to closely monitor, to see the progress, the action plan supporting the Nordic Vision 2030 was adopted. And the action plan at the time being includes 12 different goals. And these goals are valid for the time period 21 to 24. And the goals are relevant for the sectors of education, for working life, and also for the social sector. And as I said, the 3 parts in the vision should be really closely linked together. The vision and the action plan envisages investments in competence development in order to supply and support the Nordic workforce with the right competencies, and at the same time make the companies more competitive. The action plan also intends to invest in cross-sectoral cooperation and also in the connectedness of the whole Nordic region and increase mobility. As you know, the countries are not big. Each country is rather small, but the geographical area the countries cover is really big. So this movement, both physical but also movement digitally, is really important, and the action plan envisages investments in this. And basic digital competencies, of course, go through the different goals, because bridging the digital divide is a very important part of this action plan in order to get the whole population on board, whether it is countryside or cities, and all different branches in the Nordic countries, and to support their development. So this is the common Nordic initiative, and as I mentioned at the beginning, the main aim is really to support the countries in their development, which each country can take a different path, but the common knowledge and common effort can support them in this path. And I will end up this presentation with 3 thematic examples about how our networks support the development of policy and practice in each country. And the first one concerns the basic digital skills. We will still hear a few more concrete examples, but this common work was done in 2019 and 20. The Nordic countries mapped the different policies that support the development of digital skills and also provided learning examples from each country in order to inspire the countries to apply this new knowledge to their national relevant context. But the most important, from a Nordic perspective, a common issue was that it is important to link the lifelong learning policy concerning digital skills development to other policies in the country, to show the wider benefits, to show the benefits for the individual, to show the benefits for the education system, because if the better the digital skills of the population, the more people can be reached by online learning, online systems. The education system can provide cross-institutional courses and so on. Individuals can get access to health care systems in a more qualified way. And of course, the workplaces can get more motivated employees, and at the end, their profits, of course, also get higher. And in that way, the education system, the digital competence development, that even at a basic level contributes to different policies in the country. So this was a common Nordic value of this work, but besides that, of course, also showing how the countries are working in order to support the basic digital skills of adults. And the second field concerning the competence development and the common effort making skills visible is the validation of prior learning. And as you can see, the statement about the need to expand the validation is really on the agenda at the moment. There are several expert groups, so to say, and several voices that bring this need forefront. And I will talk about what expansion really needs, but I would like to say that the Nordic Network of Validation gathers key stakeholders that develop validation of prior learning in the countries, and they have stated that the validation of competencies works well. It is structured, it is well financed, but it is limited to the education system in most of the countries. Also, the social partners, employers and education and trade unions say that what is learned in working life, these competencies should also be made visible and should be validated. And finally, a new initiative, the Transvaal EU project at the EU level, has also defined the need for validating the skills that are not developed entirely in the education system, but also in the working life, and that can be used across professions and across occupations. In this project, they call them transversal skills. historically, we know also we've talked about key competencies that can be used in across different fields. So the expansion of validation of prior learning is needed, despite that it works well in the formal education system. There are different groups in Europe and Nordic countries say that both the individual and the working life would benefit if we could help individuals build their portfolio from the skills and competencies that come not only from the formal system, but also from the non-formal education system and from learning at workplaces. And there are many new groups, newcomers, at least in the Nordic countries and several European countries, who have come due to the migration situation. And if their competencies are valued towards the working life standards, they would have a better chance in this field than if they only would stay in the formal education system. So to summarize this, and the competencies from education, from working life, from free time activities should be valued. And if that should be true, then the validation as a support, as a mechanism in lifelong learning would really help individuals through the different phases of their life, and there would be less dead ends both in education or at work if the competencies gained from different fields of life would be made visible. So if this is a need, and if this is a demand in several countries, in European countries and Nordic countries, and we try to work on this in a collaborative way. And at the Nordic level, we have developed the quality compass on validation of prior learning, which can be used by the policymakers, those who develop the systems, for a short-term investigation how the system looks like. It can also be used for long-term monitoring and benchmarking between the systems and the countries. And for those who plan for the validation procedures and processes at different validation stages, there are quality assurance mechanisms that can be used through this tool. And finally, it's also for practitioners that they can do self-assessment concerning the competencies indicated needed for them. This tool is available in English, and it is gradually being also developed in all the Nordic languages. So it is something that is developed together, and then the countries can use it according to their needs, where the most development need is. And I will then end up this presentation with the third field that was also touched upon initially. How can competence development in working life be promoted? And the social partners network looked at what are the hindrances and what are the factors that support competence development in working life. And we already touched upon two of them: the need to recognize the competencies from working life, and also the basic skills competence development need. And finally, the social partners say that the digital competence has in fact become a new basic skill, new basic competence of today's working life. Besides these two that I touched upon, the social partners also stress a lot the need for the flexibility of the education system, for more dialogue between education and work in order to develop education offers that are relevant for the changing needs in the labor market. And finally, also the need for more flexible career counseling, so that the changing labor market does not leave adults in a situation where they make uninformed choices. So the career counseling in order to be able to change or develop in your working life, which in turn stimulates the motivation for learning throughout life. So these are the voices from the social partners in a common work done at the Nordic level, which then is brought back to the national contexts. And I have gathered some resources as links in my presentation. If that will be shared with everyone, then you are welcome to take a closer look at what I mentioned here today. So I will then end my presentation here. And thank you for this possibility to share the Nordic insights.
Thank you, Antra, for really inspiring presentation, especially, I think, talking about Lucene, giving more hope that pre-validation of learning might be not so bureaucratic as it is, for example, right now in Lithuania. But still, we have a few questions for you here coming from Vilnius. You mentioned the compass, and you mentioned that one of the very important aspects in the compass is the quality of validation of prior learning. So my question is to you, could you elaborate it a little bit, telling are there any concrete criteria talking about the quality assurance? Because this is probably should be very challenging, especially when we speak about non-formal validation of non-formal educational competences, for example. Thank you.
Right, and also the Nordic Network, the Nordic experts on validation, they have worked on the quality issues for many years already, and they have come up with a set of 8 indicators. There are 8 specific indicators that should be fulfilled to a certain extent if we talk about quality of validation. And of course, if they all are fulfilled to maximum, then we have a really good quality. That is not the case to many practices that have been assessed according to this, but this is something that one can strive for. And these indicators can be used, like I said, at the national systemic level, but also at an institutional practice level. And then there was a second part of the question, again, how this work then is supported. The indicators relate to the whole validation process, and without going to details, there are different stages, and there could also be an outcome that is relevant for the individual, that the validation, not full validation, is achieved. Let's say the first stage where you only map the competencies, you become aware of your competencies. And that is also sufficient in some cases, and in some cases it is important to go the full process. So the quality compass allows for the quality assurance and checking if the process is of the best quality at all these stages, not necessarily going from start to end, but that's of course could be the aim in certain organizations and of course at national systemic level. So this, I could say, yes, there is a set of indicators, and it can be applied for the whole process, but also for certain stages of the recognition and validation of prior learning.
Thank you, Antra. And there is one more question coming also from rising from your presentation, where you showed some numbers to us, and you showed that in northern countries there is a tendency that the ones with higher education or high educated people are more involved in lifelong learning processes than looking at the ones people with low educated people. Could you probably have your own assumptions? What are the reasons behind? Why such a gap? We see even twice high, I mean, based on the numbers you showed.
Well, as we know, the more you know, the more it triggers your interest, and the more it triggers and broadens your horizon. And of course, if the formal education level has stopped at certain point, and the education, you could say, people have low level of education, they don't necessarily have low skills. Maybe they have very high skills in certain things, but this drive, this motivation to acquire new things, to look beyond your skills, is maybe less if you haven't this good ground of education, and you have dropped out of school for a certain reason or stopped your education at a lower level. We also see that, speaking especially about digital competencies, that many things simply are not accessible if the digital competencies are not good enough. And it is not enough that one has learned to use a computer for for gaming, but it is a part of your daily work and competence development and also access to society. So the barriers become more complex and more complicated with time. So that's also one thing where the gap becomes bigger faster. That is also a thing that it is the risk is that you can drop out of the learning path faster if the basis of fundamental education is not there. So this is why this gap, as we saw also in the graph with the working life, it stays throughout working life.
Thank you, Antra. And I have one more question. You presented shortly about the competence reform in Norway, one of the initiative. And as you know, when we talk about lifelong learning, we usually talk from a child till an elderly people. So there is a whole lifelong learning. This is why it is called lifelong learning. But again, coming back to the whole cycle of competence-based learning, my question is related to the role of government. When you look at the education system, where do you think the government should put more attention when we speak about the education system? And we would like that our citizens in the future would be more competence oriented, okay, more oriented towards improving their competences. So it's a kind of, also the learning process. How governments here should help, or could help? Where should more attention to be paid? Is it in secondary schools? Is it in, I don't know, vocational education institutions, universities? Where this, from your experience, is this crucial period of any of us where we start to learn that, okay, I know I will have to learn the whole life and I have the skills, because this is also the skill. This is also the kind of competence to know how to learn, to even to be motivated to learn.
If I start with the first part where you said about the Norwegian competence reform, that I will leave to my colleagues from Norway. They follow after me in the presentation. There will definitely come more details. But I could say in general for the Nordic region and Nordic tradition of lifelong learning, the dialogue between the governments and the social partners, the working life representatives, is really essential concerning competence development because, like I said, not everything is done in the education system. Equally much is done in working life, but there should be dialogue between these systems in order to adjust, adapt, and be flexible and develop. It is not that we can create one education system and it is ready for many years ahead. There come new challenges, new changes, and there's a need to adapt and change the system. And there's a dialogue between what is demanded from adults or from young people by the labor market is really essential. And the other part, what I mentioned before, was the transversal skills, the key competencies, the learning to learn skills, the creativity, taking responsibility. These are the skills that help us throughout life. The question is, where are they developed? At school, in the kindergarten, in the labor market, maybe everywhere. But these competencies have not been made visible enough, not only in terms for the working life, but also for the individual itself. If the individual understands, appreciates these competencies and see how they can be used in different fields of life, then it enlarges the portfolio. My individual portfolio becomes better if I realize I in fact can take responsibility. So it's the hard skills, the competencies, the dialogue between education system and working life is really essential, but also making these softer skills, transversal skills, visible for the individual and for the society are essential. And we are not there yet. There have been different attempts. And like I said, the new European Transval project, where, by the way, Lithuania is also involved, there will come some interesting results from experimentation and tests and research after 22, 23, so in a year and a half. So there are constant developments. We just have to look for ways to improve constantly.
Well, thank you, Antra, once more for inspiring presentation. It was really interesting talking to you. I'm sure our audience started to think about maybe there are some opportunities to improve themselves actually even today, who knows. So thank you, Antra, once more.